Participant number is stabilizing, so I think we'll start. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the third and final session in our series of community-wide discussions on a Biological Collections Action Center. It's great to have you all with us. My name is Pam Soltis from IWGSC and the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'll be joined shortly by 5 colleagues who will offer their perspectives on an action center to help set the stage for our discussion. Next slide, please. But before we embark on our discussion, I'd like to make a few housekeeping and procedural announcements. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available online at the webinar series wiki page after the webinar. You may use the chat feature to interact with panelists and attendees, but please don't use it for asking questions. Instead, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to type in your questions for the speakers. Alternatively, you can raise your virtual hand on Zoom and we will call on you to ask your question. We will also be using the discourse platform to capture questions and comments, and more on that in just a few minutes. And finally, we will address questions after the presentations. So next slide, please. So today's session is the third of 3 webinars on the topic of a Biological Collections Action Center. And although this is the final webinar, there will be some follow-up discussion via workshops, focus groups, and the discourse platform. So please stay tuned. Next slide, please. So what is the Biological Collections Action Center, and what has prompted this series of discussions? For those of you who have not been able to join us previously, I'll give a brief overview to set the stage for today's discussion. And if you have been with us the past couple of weeks, well, you can just take a very short break. So the term Action Center for Biological Collections was introduced in 2020 in the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or NASEM, consensus study report entitled Biological Collections, Ensuring Critical Research and Education for the 21st Century. Although introduced in the NASEM report, the concept of a coordinating body for biological collections was presented by the Biological Collections Network, or BCoN, in its report, The Extended Specimen Network, published in 2019. So this is a concept that has been building in the collections community for several years. Next slide, please. Our current community dialogue on a Biological Collections Action Center was prompted by passage last summer of the bipartisan U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, which President Biden signed into law on August 9th. Included in this $280 billion package is verbal support for biological collections through an action center. However, funds have not been appropriated for the center, and the nature of the center has not been determined. So I'll just repeat that for emphasis. Funds have not been appropriated for the center, and the nature of the center has not been determined. Our ongoing discussions will help collect community input on what such a center might entail. Again, no funds have been appropriated, no description has been written, no plans have been made, and our purpose in these webinars and throughout subsequent workshops and focus groups is to gather community input. Next. So to that end, IWGSC has also launched a community discussion using the discourse platform, and you can just see a screenshot of that here. And we invite you to use this platform to share your thoughts and reactions in the coming weeks and even months. And a final note, the U.S. CHIPS and Science Act is aimed at STEM infrastructure and workforce training in the U.S., so some of the discussion will necessarily focus on the U.S. However, we welcome perspectives from the international community as well, particularly as the collections community continues to push new boundaries in international collaboration. Next slide. So let's return to the NASEM report and what it says about an action center. In this 244-page report, the Action Center is first mentioned on page 15 in the summary and is further developed in Chapter 8 entitled Taking Collaborative Action. The relevant information is as follows. The National Science Foundation, in collaboration with other institutions that provide funding and other types of support for biological collections, should help establish a permanent national action center for biological collections to coordinate action and knowledge, resources, and data sharing among the nation's biological collections as they strive to meet the complex and often unpredictable needs of science and society. Such an action center should include a physical space and cyber infrastructure to develop and implement collaborative strategic efforts and further build and nurture communities of practice for research, education, workforce training, evaluation, and business model development, among other community-wide needs. But the committee deliberately stopped short of prescribing a more detailed vision for the center, and our webinar series will start to make the vision more concrete and ultimately, we hope, help to turn it into reality. Next slide. So our previous discussions covered a number of topics, and these are summarized to some extent in this word cloud. Our previous panelists were all members of the committee that wrote the NASEM report. And today, instead, we'll hear some perspectives from additional stakeholders, members of the Federal Interagency Working Group on Scientific Collections, the American Institute of Biological Sciences, and the Biodiversity Collections Network, again, BCoN. As in the past, those speakers represent a set of U.S. perspectives, given that our discussions are in response to a U.S. law, but we welcome discourse with the international community. Next. So at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleagues. Our first presentation is by members of the Interagency Working Group on Scientific Collections. Scott Miller from the Smithsonian and one of the co-chairs of the working group will begin, and he'll be joined by working group members Kevin Hackett from the USDA and co-chair of the working group, and Diane DiEuliis from the Department of Defense and executive secretary of the working group. So Scott, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll start with the next slide, please. So the Interagency Working Group on Scientific Collections represents 15 agencies and departments of the federal government that either own or fund scientific collections. And we cover science quite broadly, and thus the IWGSC is an interesting place to discuss scientific collections issues rather broadly. I should say that the views that we're presenting here are our personal views as individuals. They're not official positions of the US government or the agencies at this time. One of the things that we've done over the years is really push on the policy issues around viewing scientific collections as research and development infrastructure that is in need of base funding. That resulted, among other things, in a statement to that effect in the American Competes Act of 2010, and most recently in the White House National Strategic Overview for Research and Development Infrastructure issued last year, and pictured here, available on the web. We've also recently looked at economic models for collections, both ways that they can support themselves monetarily and also how they can demonstrate their non-monetary value. That report is available online at the IWGSC website. It's this blue report cover here. I won't go into any detail on it, but to just say two of the more interesting outcomes of that study was that specimens are often most valuable for their secondary uses. That is, uses other than the reasons why they were collected in the first place. And interest in particular specimens often increases over time. Throughout the history of the IWGSC, we've worked on current and future uses of collections, and we actually have a new report in production on that, which we hope will be available in the next couple of months. So Kevin Hackett will provide some examples of the breadth of scientific collections, and Diane will provide some examples of the bioeconomy and biosecurity, and I will turn over to Kevin on the next slide.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Hello, everybody. Whilst USDA collections are used primarily for ag research, especially plant and animal germplasm for breeding, many are also systematics and taxonomic collections used by APHIS for port identifications. And most collaborations have a natural history aspect in the broadest sense. That's wild plant varieties that are used as genetic material for breeding crops, or microbes, fauna, and flora for ecological studies. These collections also serve as genomics raw material. For example, the Earth Biogenome Project effort to sequence all eukaryotes, which in turn facilitates biotechnology in support of the bioeconomy. Using the extended specimen concept to link specimen to genomics and biology, we're also hoping to tie specimens to our LTAR network that's similar to it's the ag counterpart to LTAR. I'll describe a few select examples of USDA collections, including how an action center might help these collections and how these collections might help an action center. Also note that most of our collections are living with attendant challenges. So next slide. Our microbial collection at Peoria is one of the largest public collections of microbes in the world, housing one of 2 patent collections in the US. ARS has the microbial pipeline, but an action center might help increase collaborations, providing scientists in computational biology, synthetic biology, and microbial physiology to apply collections to discovery for food biosecurity and to counter novel pathogens. In other words, to get more value out of the collections. Potential contributions by the department to an action center might be contributing 5,000 strains per year to 40 countries. As with all our large collections, we have an extensive expertise to share in collections management, including databases and specimen distribution. Next slide. The U.S. National Collection of Insects and Mites is a joint effort by USDA and Smithsonian, where most of the specimens are housed. There are 36 million specimens, pin or slide mounted, some ethanol or freezer preserved. The scientists provide taxonomic services while conducting systematics research. They develop digital and molecular ID tools and databases of taxonomic and biological information. Insects are highly diverse. For example, see the lower right photo of the smallest bee perched on the eye of the largest bee. In fact, insects make up 85% of all animal species. So efforts like I5K to sequence insects, BCoN to sequence bees, Ag100Pest to sequence pests are all umbrellaed by the Earth Biogenome Project. They're all dependent on these collections. And related to this effort, the Smithsonian is helping to lead the Global Genome Biodiversity Network of over 100 countries to voucher specimen tissues of a quality useful for genome sequencing, and again, consistent with the expanded specimen concept. An action center might help with larger pipelines for data transfer, bring about a collections training research building in the DC area, focusing on national concerns, and grants for proactive research on superpests and their relatives. In turn, our scientists would help with training and mentoring. Next slide. The livestock gene bank at the National Animal Germplasm Collection in Fort Collins stores over 1.2 million living samples from cattle to chickens, also aquatic species and exotic species such as yak. The focus is preservation and genotyping with a stakeholder network of 3,000 US contributors. Recently, the collection was used to improve national dairy cattle production, an industry worth $200 billion to the US economy. The center also supports NIH health and NOAA conservation efforts. An action center would facilitate collaborations in the areas of climate change and food security. And of course, this is a main goal of all of our collections, is to improve their impact by addressing national issues and international issues. In return, we contribute our intergovernmental network of gene banks. Next slide. For the plant side of Fort Collins, the collection is mostly seeds whose viability is tested. Perhaps an action center could help with multispectral imaging to document seed traits for a very wide range of crops and crop wild relatives, really tying imaging into other data, et cetera, sound data and genomics data, et cetera, has really got to be the one of the major purposes of an action center. In turn, Fort Collins can provide secure seed storage which it does now for more than 450,000 accessions from over 70 source collaborators. Importantly, the center's minus 18-degree centigrade freezers are only at half capacity for seed storage, so storage space can also be shared. Last slide, the National Arboretum houses nearly 1 million preserved plant specimens. The Arboretum provides identification services and supports other agencies in ag biodiversity, and also develops new ornamentals. It's part of the National Plant Germplasm System, growing and conserving 25,000 plus accessions. The center would benefit from improved data integration between collections and greater IT, storage, computational support. Its main contribution would be a fully digitized herbarium with public portal. And like many of our collections, this one serves at the intersection of research, that's plant breeding, conservation, that's germplasm, and documentation preservation, that's herbaria. So thank you, and I'll now pass to Diane DiEuliis.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation to present to you all today. It's a pleasure to be presenting with Scott and Kevin, who really carry the weight of the IWGSC on their shoulders. I'm going to mention some emerging uses of traditional collections that maybe have not yet been discussed yet in the context of a collections action center. And those are using collections at the intersection of zoonotic disease and trying to mitigate pandemics, in support of biosecurity, and potential role, what I think is a very important role for scientific collections in the U.S. bioeconomy, not only as drivers of innovation. Kevin, I'm so glad you showed all those amazing collections that could be driving the bioeconomy, but also as vouchers for biosecurity, and I'll explain that in a sec. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this chart is taken from actually a report that was written following a meeting of SciCall, Scientific Collections International, that I was a part of along with David Schindel and Eileen Graham. And I won't go through all of the details of this, but the meeting brought together disease specialists, infectious disease specialists with collections specialists. And they painstakingly went through all the different phases of a biological outbreak and determined all of the areas in which collections play a sincerely vital role, from detection, characterization, and mitigation throughout the pandemic. And it's sort of this report, which I've shared the link to, presaged exactly what happened during COVID-19 and how all of these scientific collections related to public health were desperately needed in mitigation of the pandemic. If you go to the next slide, I want to say a few words about biosecurity. So once again, this report and these findings were taken from a meeting which brought together this time biosecurity and biodefense professionals with collections professionals. And I was fortunate to have Scott Miller help chair this meeting to look at the role of biological specimens in biosecurity. So not only are they forming the baselines and standards, but they're helping us to better understand organisms of concern. The way that we do biosecurity is based on a list of the most dangerous organisms to humans, plants, and animals. And as we dug into this workshop, it became readily apparent how much diversity there is. Some of you may remember that a number of years ago, they found anthrax on the International Space Station, which caused a huge stir in the biodefense community. And it took a number of years for them to sort out that that was not a bioweapon, that it was a differently evolved strain of anthrax. And they used dozens of anthrax scientific collections to be able to do the forensics. So forensics and attribution is extremely important. And we also echoed many of the global health security issues that were brought up in the SciCall report. If you go to the next slide, I want to just take a brief moment to define what we are talking about when we talk about the bioeconomy. I was involved in a National Academy study in 2020 entitled Safeguarding the Bioeconomy, which I highly recommend if you have not read it. It's a bit lengthy, but it's worth it. And basically, this is about how we are using bioengineering in computing and information sciences to bioengineer organisms for purposeful things like the creation of chemicals, for example, through biological processes instead of through petroleum processes. So where we have formally seen a lot of this in pharmaceuticals and medicine, and of course, agriculture has been doing this for a long time, we're now seeing the use of bioengineering going into other sectors like materials, energy, fuels, foods, consumer goods, and things like this. On the next slide, I've shown just a handful of examples. This is just the tip of the iceberg of some of the things that people are doing in the bioeconomy. So we have people using engineered microbes for probiotics, and of course, engineering microbes that can fix nitrogen and reduce the use of toxic fertilizers. There's a company out in California that is doing the creation of synthetic spider silk for the North Face, making these parkas, and they're also making something they call Milo leather, which is synthetic leather that's made out of cellulosic material from engineered fungi. Up on the right, there's a company called BioMason in North Carolina that is making concrete from engineered algae. And people may not realize that the creation of concrete and bricks, sort of on an everyday basis all around the world, is a contributor of 8% of the CO2 that goes into our atmosphere. So if we can make cement without that energetic process, like using algae as well to make gas or jet fuel, we can really reduce the carbon footprint. And lastly, and importantly, I want to mention this idea of species rescue. There are some folks who want to reconstitute entire species. And in this case, I've highlighted the beloved American chestnut tree, which at the height of its growth in the United States was removing megatons of carbon from the atmosphere. But I want to issue a word of caution. These are all very exciting developments and have many benefits. And I think that scientific collections, we haven't even explored all the innovation that they could bring to these kinds of things that would be good. But at the same time, we have to have some caution and understanding of what tinkering with these organisms mean. And scientific collections are going to be indispensable for that as well. We need to understand biodiversity. We need to understand if we put something like many more chestnut trees back into the environment, what are the outcomes for ecologies and ecosystems. So I see collections as playing a huge role here, and I see the Action Center in all three of these examples, maybe bringing together the expertise and the resources that can have bearing on public health, biosecurity, and the bioeconomy. The last thing I would say, and the Action Center may have some role in this as well, is that many of these things that are driving the bioeconomy have financial benefits. And across the world, we've seen efforts geared towards using samples for access and benefit sharing. And so that is something I wanted to flag in this. And with that, I will turn this back over to Scott, who's going to summarize some of these issues. Thank you.
So we'll go to the next slide, and just wanted to lay out some parameters of what we've been thinking about in terms of a broad vision for an action center. Firstly, we feel like it should encompass all kinds of biological collections, and I think Diane and Kevin did a great job of showing why we should include some of those kinds of collections, and perhaps other disciplines. It should clearly embrace existing efforts in partners, and many of these, both internationally and nationally, have been talked about in the previous webinars. I want to particularly emphasize GBIF, which is established as an international organization for some of these things. ISPR, the Frozen Collections people, the Global Collections Group of museums who've been doing some very interesting things with ways to do rapid inventory and assessment of holdings and what that means, and the Biodiversity Heritage Library. As Diane was saying, we can enable non-traditional uses, including the bioeconomy, while also addressing the very important access and benefits sharing and equity kinds of issues. And this is a place where an action center may be able to get economies of scale, so not every collection has to go and reinvent how to deal with some of those legal issues. As has been talked about before, it needs to provide cyber infrastructure that takes advantage of economies of scale and includes dealing with data standards, FAIR principles, extended specimen concept, etc., and build capacity and workforce broadly. Next slide. It could act as a convener or coordinator to address national needs that is externally facing from the collections. And first, we would have to figure out what are the sort of core information needs that the communities want from the collection. And those could include many things, and I just have a few examples here. Environmental monitoring, especially in the face of climate change. And there is a national nature assessment being organized out of the White House and a number of agencies, which provides an opportunity to define some of those questions. And then, of course, we have health, biosecurity, bioeconomy, and then a number of specific needs, including, and just to highlight one, the need to identify and rapidly understand pest and invasive species that are, the next invasive species is literally anything from anywhere. And we have to be ready for that. Next slide. It could also act as a convener or coordinator to address the needs of the collections themselves, that is internally facing. And some of those things would include the vital step of assessing what are the collective collections, resources, and gaps. Collaborative sampling strategies for new collections, as was discussed in the last webinar. And as part of that, coordination with long-term sampling efforts such as NEON and LTER. Matchmaking with orphan collections has been discussed before, as has planning for best practices, both for collections management and these business aspects. And of course, building capacity and workforce broadly. Next slide. I'll just wrap up with a few final thoughts that get a little bit more nebulous than the other ones, but we think they're important. The first one is we need to be clear about balancing the addressing national needs, since this would be a US funding activity, but while also contributing globally to the collections and biodiversity enterprises. And an important part of that is addressing access and benefits sharing and ethical issues. We believe that there is an opportunity here for a novel partnership among multiple US government agencies, as well as the private sector, in which I'm including other government entities like states, to provide a diverse and lasting support base for the Action Center, so that it's not just based on a 10-year grant from one particular agency and faces a cliff at the end, but that would allow it to also serve more disciplines and constituents more readily. And this one gets a little bit speculative, but it's worth mentioning. This idea of having a coordination center in the Action Center might provide a creative solution to issues that have arisen around collections from federal lands. And I'll just say a little bit more about that. Several federal entities currently exert ownership of specimens that originated from land that they own. When those specimens have ended up in non-federal repositories, either by intent or default, the specimens can be trapped in an awkward situation. For example, in digitization processes, the repository may not have funding for handling those particular specimens. The federal entity that owns them may not have funding to cover their digitization. And then there have been cases where National Science Foundation may have provided a collections care grant or a digitization grant, but may disqualify those specimens from being cared for under that grant because they're federally owned. So while discussions are very preliminary about this, there is a possible way forward in the Action Center. The details are complex, but they're not unlike the international access and benefit sharing issues that we will have to address anyway. So I'll just throw out 4 ideas. There are a number of models of what's being called shared stewardship that are being negotiated in the museum world, especially for the long-term care of cultural objects. We often in the museum business get hung up on the term ownership versus the terms custody or access, which may actually matter more. And that actually forms the basis of an agreement that the Smithsonian has with the National Park Service for the management of National Park Service specimens in Smithsonian custody. An action center might emphasize the public interest in access to the digital representation of such specimens, thus facilitating investment in that digital representation by multiple partners, regardless of the actual ownership of the specimens in question. And at least for state-owned repositories, which would include many universities, existing models of state and federal partnerships might be a way forward. For example, the Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit and the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. So that's the end of our remarks for today.
So thanks so much, Scott, Kevin, and Diane for sharing those thoughts and the perspective of the federal collections and the expertise that you all bring to this entire field that differs from what we've been discussing the last few weeks. So thank you again so much. So our next presenter is Jyotsna Pandey from the American Institute of Biological Sciences. Jyotsna is the Public Policy Director for AIBS, and she also serves as Executive Director of the Natural Science Collections Alliance, and she's also a member of the BCoN Steering Committee. Jyotsna?
Thank you, Pam, and thanks to AIBS for this opportunity to speak on this very exciting topic. I've been asked to provide some perspectives from AIBS. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with us, AIBS is a national scientific society dedicated to promoting the use of science to inform decision-making and advancing biology for the benefit of science and society. And it brings together a diverse group of more than 100 member organizations, including scientific societies, professional associations, academic departments, museums, science collections, and others to advance common goals and interests. And my primary role at AIBS is to lead its effort on science policy and advocacy, but I'm also heavily involved with our professional development and training programs, and my goal today is to speak from those perspectives. So AIBS represents a wide range of societies and organizations, as I mentioned, and this includes organismal societies that represent the wider research community that needs to be engaged in these discussions about, about the research needs an action center for biological collections could fill. It would be really important to widen these discussions beyond the usual suspects, and that's a point that's been made many times during this webinar and in other similar discussions, because we really need to hear from researchers about what their needs are and how we can connect the dots between their needs and what the collections community has to offer, with the ultimate goal of expanding the user base for all kinds of collections. Next slide, please. So in addition to our advocacy work on behalf of the biological sciences community at large, AIBS has been a strong advocate for collections for a long time. Persistent advocacy for federal funding support is an important part of that, but we've also been active on a number of other issues that affect collections, including those related to the workforce and the bioeconomy. An example of a recent notable effort that AIBS led was our effort to secure passage of the CHIPS and Science Act, the bill Pam talked about that has prompted this Action Center effort, as well as other efforts related to a specimen management plan requirement that BCoN has been working in partnership with the U.S. Culture Collection Network. And AIBS was certainly not alone in advocacy for the CHIPS and Science Act. We worked in partnership with NSCA, BCoN, Spinach, and representatives from each of these groups participated in meetings and wrote letters to lawmakers supporting the collections provisions of the CHIPS and Science Act. Now, I mentioned NSCA, so the Natural Science Collections Alliance is a key strategic partner for AIBS. NSCA is a national nonprofit association that supports natural science collections, the institutions that house them, as well as their human resources. A key role that NSCA plays is providing representation for collections institutions in Washington, D.C. and beyond. An example is NSCA's work with AIBS on the One Health Security Act. This is the legislation from Senator Kirsten Gillibrand's office that aims to create a mechanism to enhance interagency coordination and strengthen early warning and detection systems to rapidly respond to emerging biological threats like pandemics. And NSCA and AIBS drafted comments on the bill late last year, urging that the bill be expanded to include biodiversity infrastructure, including collections and biorepositories, as a critical component of our national research infrastructure for pathogen prediction, surveillance, mitigation. And the final comments that we submitted were endorsed by several other societies, and we're hoping to see those comments reflected in the version that is introduced again in the new Congress this year. Now, over more than a decade, AIBS has supported key research coordination activities to build national capacity for digitizing and mobilizing the data associated with biological collections. A key initiative that AIBS is centrally involved in since 2014 is the Biodiversity Collections Network, or BCoN, which emerged from a 5-year research coordination network grant awarded to AIBS. AIBS continues to manage and facilitate BCoN meetings and initiatives, which you will hear in more detail about in the next presentation from Breda, Zimkus. Another thing I just want to mention here is the USA Nagoya Protocol Action Group, which AIBS has been helping to lead since 2021. This is an informal group of researchers and collections professionals who work to raise awareness about the requirements of the Nagoya Protocol. And recent efforts of this group have focused on the discussions around the access and benefit sharing of digital sequence information. So AIBS organized an online workshop series on this issue in the fall of 2021 in partnership with 18 other societies where researchers from around the world shared their experiences with Nagoya and their perspectives on ABS, of digital sequence information. And notably, participants discussed the unique and important role of biorepositories, which are increasingly important facilitators between the so-called users and providers, as well as instruments for access and benefit sharing. And these issues of Nagoya Protocol compliance and ABS could be key issues for the Action Center to address and guide the community on. Next slide, please. In addition to these, AIBS has regularly highlighted collections through various other initiatives. For example, our work on the bioeconomy a few years ago, we published a couple policy relevant articles on the bioeconomy and its workforce, which featured collections prominently, and a subsequent council meeting of AIBS member societies that year tackled the subject and also brought perspectives from collections to the forefront. AIBS regularly convenes council meetings of its member organizations and societies on topics of common concern, and these meetings have brought together representatives from academia, nonprofits, federal agencies, minority serving groups to discuss a wide range of issues. And some of the recent topics have included things like increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in science, strengthening the bioeconomy, next-gen international biology, how to effectively engage policymakers. And collections have been a significant part of these discussions in most, if not all of the meetings. Next slide, please. And another way that AIBS regularly supports and highlights collections is through our flagship journal, Bioscience. In 2020, Bioscience established a special topical collection of articles featuring natural history collections, which highlights some of the exciting new ways that scientists and educators are mobilizing and using biodiversity data from natural history collections. Next slide, please. So with that overview of how AIBS has been working to support and advocate for the collections community, here are some issues we'd like to see the Action Center focus on. And I believe all of these have been mentioned in one form or another during the webinar series, but they're worth reiterating in this final webinar. A key role that the Action Center can play is being the developer and clearinghouse for best practices and educational resources, whether we're talking about next generation collection practices to build robust collections or continuing to support collections digitization across the country, or establishing data standards and enabling data integration, or enabling legal compliance with policies like Nagoya. Another significant area would be enabling novel collaborative cross-domain research, the Action Center presents an opportunity to build something big, that engages the broader scientific community in leveraging collections to address persistent challenges. It provides an opportunity to expand the use of collections-derived data to potential users in not only systematics, ecology, epidemiology, but also climatology and molecular biology. And there are opportunities to enable more robust longitudinal studies by leveraging archived data and specimens and by integrating ecological data. There are also opportunities to expand our reach to non-conventional stakeholders by drawing connections with grand challenges of climate change and bioeconomy and One Health and emerging pathogens, as Diane also mentioned. And to do all this, it would be important to coordinate with other national and international biological, ecological, environmental data initiatives to ensure that our data is interoperable with them, a point that has been made a couple of times earlier. And as I see it, professional development and training should be critical services that the center can provide, whether we're talking about digitization or effective communication and advocacy or something like enabling interdisciplinary and team science. Professional development and training is going to be crucial in preparing the next generation workforce. Importantly, AIBS in our community cares very strongly about open science and team science and fair data principles. And these are ideals we hope will be central to the foundations of the Action Center. Improving DEI is going to be a key issue for the Action Center to move the needle on, and scientific societies are great resources to leverage in that endeavor. A number of biological societies, including AIBS, are leading DEI efforts through the NSF LEAPS program. And this is something that can be amplified and built upon and leveraged by the center. And we've also talked about engaging a wide range of stakeholder communities, and building partnerships with diverse societies could be a way to engage the leading voices in those various communities. And finally, the Action Center would provide the ideal platform to realize the community-informed vision of the extended specimen network. Leadership and coordination is needed at several levels to bring such a network, to build such a network, and to facilitate the integration of the data that it envisions, and to ensure access to this data for broad research and user base. And Breda will speak to this in more detail, but the Action Center will be the key force for making it all happen. Next slide, please. And I just want to end my remarks by saying a little bit about what I think the core functions could be for the Action Center. Long-term strategic planning and envisioning would certainly be a core function, but also in the shorter term, providing consultation and guidance to the community and serving as a one-stop shop for information and resource sharing. The center would serve a facilitation and coordination function to accelerate discovery and innovation, build key partnerships, as well as empower the next-gen workforce, but also engage more widely with decision makers and the public to communicate the importance of collections and the value of collections. So one of the things I'll add on top of that is that the Action Center could leverage the planning and envisioning that is currently being done by community think tanks, so to speak, like BCoN and other groups that are leading efforts along those lines, to really lead strategic visionary discussions and to produce and provide products and services that are needed within the community. We've heard concerns about the Action Center potentially having a federalized top-down approach. This is not how I've been approaching the concept of an Action Center. I really view this as an entity that would serve a facilitating function. It would enable coordination around shared scientific priorities and societal needs, and it wouldn't really dictate or control how the community operates, but rather help to fill functional needs within the community. The function I'm particularly interested in is the communications and outreach function. Now, last week, Joe Cook emphasized the need to elevate the national standing of biological collections as critical infrastructure to enable research that addresses societal needs. And communication and advocacy is a key part of that effort. A challenge in the collections community has been that it has struggled at times to have a coherent and resonant message. And there's a need for better communication with different audiences. And the community has not historically sold the story of all the really exciting stuff that is being done with biodiversity collections. And we need to do a better job of communicating the outcomes and benefits of digitization to policymakers, administrators, administrators, other scientists, as well as the public. And that's not to say that we're not communicating this at all. In fact, there have been some pretty big successes along the way, and that is why we're here today. But there are several disparate entities that work in this sphere, and messaging is not necessarily coordinated. Societies are certainly active in this domain, but a collective, coordinated, targeted approach is needed to present a unified voice for collections to ensure sustainability. And the Action Center could work, with societies, help them articulate the vision so they can be effective advocates. And it could also enable and cultivate individual community members who are effective advocates for the community. So I will just end with that, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jyotsna. That was a really great overview of all of the many things that AIBS does to help support collections, and your perspectives on that were really valuable as well. So thank you. So our final presenter today is Breda Zimkus, who is the Director of Collections Operations at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. And Breda is also a member of the BCoN Steering Committee. So Breda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for giving me the time to talk about the perspectives from BCoN, and to everyone in the audience who has stayed for the last presentation of this 3-webinar series. Next slide, please. So the Biodiversity Collections Network, or BCoN, as Jyotsna mentioned, emerged from a 5-year RCN grant from NSF. It was founded by AIBS, Spinach, and the Natural Science Collections Alliance, but we have 36 other supporting organizations, and we're always looking for more, so please reach out if you would like to partner with us. We promote the use and expand the accessibility of biodiversity collections and their data, and one of our goals is to extend the impact of biodiversity collections as critical infrastructure for research and education. Next slide, please. So we currently have 15 steering committee members, which you can see here, bringing together representatives from a very wide range of U.S. biological collections, from living, preserved, and fossilized biological and geological collections. And I did want to note that almost all of us have day jobs. So we are managing biodiversity collections, conducting research, and teaching. So we are doing this above and beyond all of the other things we do. So we can only dedicate so much time to it. So it has its limitations in that respect. Next slide, please. So BCoN has engaged in a number of different activities, all with the goal of both educating and engaging stakeholders on various issues associated with biological collections. Here are just some of the examples. You heard from Jyotsna about advocacy and letter writing, campaign to policymakers, basically led to the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act. We've done community surveys to kind of take the pulse of what is happening in our community in relation to COVID, podcasts to engage the public and teach them about the importance of collections. To date, we have done 10 webinars, and our most recent was the need for a specimen management plan requirement, which was co-hosted by the U.S. Culture Collections Network. A number of different workshops. The one I was probably most involved with was addressing legal issues involved in digitized collections using the Nagoya Protocol as a test case. Most of those workshops led to reports, which you can view on our website. And then we have had 2 peer-reviewed journal articles discussing the future of biological collections. Next slide, please. So BCoN has promoted the development of the Extended Specimen Network as a unifying goal for biological collections over the next decade and beyond. In 2019, BCoN published the Extended Specimen Report using input gathered from stakeholders regarding future directions for collections. This figure on the right should be familiar to many of you. We have our physical specimen, and within that kind of orange area, we have the primary extension where you have the primary data associated with the specimen, where, when it was collected and by whom. And then you also have the digital records stored in the collection management system, like the media, images, audio, video files. And as you go into those yellow and green, the secondary and tertiary extensions, it's harder to find that data that's out on the web. because it's disconnected from the original physical specimen and the collection management system where it's located. So it can make it difficult to find and connect that data with the specimen. We can make some of those connections manually, but it's a very labor-intensive process. Next slide, please. With the extended specimen network, when it's realized, a persistent identifier could be used to uniquely identify digital information about a specimen, and we could find all that data that's online. The connections established via the extended specimen network will enable novel analyses, coordinated co-analyses, and transdisciplinary studies. Those managing biodiversity collections could either link out to the digital extended specimen record or ingest data back into their collection management systems, eliminating the need to do things manually and allowing us to more easily demonstrate how our collections are being used. Next slide, please. So in 2021, members of BCoN published a follow-up paper identifying 5 conceptual pillars of the extended specimen network, which were areas of overlap between the 2019 BCoN report and the 2020 NASEM report. So essentially, for collections to remain relevant, they need to continue to grow. Digitization must continue, not only to maintain the current momentum, but also to facilitate the discovery of dark data residing in unknown or undigitized collections. We need seamless data integration, as well as the training of current and future biodiversity workforce members. And lastly, we need to consider infrastructure, both at the institutional level and the community level, to maximize the value of our collections. As Pam has mentioned, both the BCoN and NASEM reports made it clear that some entity was needed to move forward with this vision, and the BCoN report called it a central coordinating unit, and the NASEM report called it an action center. Next slide, please. So we at BCoN see this action center as a hub that can facilitate making connections, so we can move forward in those 5 areas that I just described. In regard to new collections, the Action Center could coordinate the development of best practices regarding specimen and data collection. This could include developing new workflows and/or technologies to make data ingestion easier and quicker, because we don't want to add to the existing digitization backlog. It could also promote holistic collecting, like Joe Cook mentioned at our last webinar. Researchers definitely need help in relation to the complex permitting landscape that now exists as a result of the Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing. So having resources and personnel that they can reach out to when they have questions about a specific country and what their regulations are would be very, very useful. And we've heard a lot about this, but connecting researchers with institutions that would accession their collections would be a very important thing for this action center. Many of us at BCoN hope that a specimen management plan will be required for NSF proposals at some point in the future. But even if it isn't, we should have a mechanism to make these connections so that fewer collections become orphaned. The same mechanism used to connect researchers with institutions that would accession their collections could be used for orphan collections, as others have called it, a match.com for museums. An action center could be involved in the development of next generation digitization technology to improve efficiency, particularly for harder to digitize collections. And for example, parasite collections have some really difficult inherent challenges since they are prepared and stored with their host organisms. The development of the underlying cyber infrastructure needed for the extended specimen network is a whole webinar on its own. And getting stakeholders to adopt the associated best practice standards is a huge undertaking. And this I envision as a major focus of the Action Center. Next and last slide. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, back one. An action center could provide equitable access to education and training to those who might be involved in the creation of the underlying cyber infrastructure. It could provide professional development to our current workforce. on the impacts and benefits of the extended specimen network, as well as other topics like emerging technologies and novel research techniques using collections. It could also engage end users of biodiversity data to promote research using the data from the extended specimen network. And lastly, the Action Center could advocate for biodiversity collections to ensure long-term sustainability of both the physical specimens and the digital data on the extended specimen network. Although institutions would have to advocate individually for their own infrastructure, an Action Center could support them in strategic planning, especially if we have metrics that we could pull from the extended specimen network to demonstrate the importance of collections and how often specimens from an institution are being used. By identifying all the biodiversity collections and connecting us to each other, we can also become more knowledgeable, and we can speak with a unified voice when we make connections with those outside of our community. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Breda. Thanks for the work that you and other members of BCoN are doing, and thanks for raising all of these really important points. We're down to only about 5 minutes or so left for questions, but maybe Jill, if you could stop sharing for a minute, we could have all of our panelists up. We have a few questions in the Q&A, and we'll just start out with the first one. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, which means that I should be quiet here, but I want to get through this quickly. And so if any of our panelists actually need to leave sharply on the hour, please do so. If you are available to stick around for a few more minutes, I'm sure that the audience participants would be appreciative of that. So the first question that was raised was by Europe Poland, and it has actually been addressed to some extent in the Q&A section, but I think it's an important point to bring up. So Europe writes, as an independent working with CCO data sets dramatically reduces the barrier to reuse collection data and develop tools to facilitate cross-collection and cross-disciplinary integrations. So the question to the panelists is, how do you see licensing as a way to facilitate control and facilitate or control reuse? And how do your colleagues use CCO? And Kevin, you addressed this with a link. I wonder if you might want to make a few comments.
Okay. I can't seem to get my video on, but anyway, I'll just say that so basically at USDA, at the National Agricultural Library, we have an Ag Data Commons, and we prefer a Creative Commons CC0 public domain dedication. The data is created by the US government, and it may be in the US public domain. The important thing is, for non-federal data, copyright holders may choose a Creative Commons attribution. That's a CC BY license. So the data can be embargoed up to 30 months, in which case a placeholder with a full description of the forthcoming data will be posted publicly. And that's basically all I know about that system.
Thanks. Would anybody else like to comment on licensing and copyright and access to data?
I just want to say, I feel like one of the barriers is not being able to know how our specimens are being used. So if we do have the extended specimen network and there's a mechanism by which we can track their use, then maybe the community could move towards this CC0. I know for us, we use a Creative Commons license, but it's, I can't remember, NC BY. So basically we're asking for attribution, but if it's being used for research or education, images, other media can be used freely.
Thank you. Because some people need to leave, I think maybe we could go briefly, Jill, to our last slide so that we can get the QR code up there. And then we can come back to a little bit more discussion if people have time. Great, thank you. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our presenters, Scott, Kevin, Diane, Jyotsna, and Breda, for sharing their thoughts today. And thank you also to our panelists from the past couple of weeks as well. Also, many thanks to Jill Goodwin, Gil Nelson, Lauren Cohen, and Jesse Grasso behind the scenes for making sure that things have been running smoothly. And thanks to all of our audience for your participation. So I'd like to remind you to please watch for further discussion on the Biological Action Center. Please contribute via the discourse platform. And also, finally, please complete the survey that's available at the QR code on your screen or at, I think, a link that's going to pop into the chat. So just want to thank everyone. And again, those of you panelists who need to leave, please feel free to do so with our gratitude for your participation today. But if you can stick around a little bit longer, we do have a few more questions. So maybe we'll go to the next question. And the next one that I'll pull out here is one of the ones that Deb Paul has raised. She says, I'm curious how any large models like the one being envisioned for this action center would support or encourage the work of individuals. Similar to Yorit's question, I'm thinking about bionomia. The idea and actions of a single individual are fundamentally changing culture for collections data management. We're moving from isolated collections knowledge management to shared management. And I'm thinking is this innovation we don't want to lose when we're talking about national infrastructures and liaisons with other large groups. So if there are any comments about how folks here would associate with some of these large long-term funded projects, if you have some input on how to allow people to not just retain their autonomy, but also to encourage that sort of innovation while also supporting them through and the community through a large scale enterprise. Deb, do you want to comment further on your question and comment?
Well, I would dearly love to talk more about this at any point. I think that for those of you who haven't used Bionomia yet, if you're here and you haven't tried it, please give it a shot. From my perspective, other people who can tell you more about how this is fundamentally changing how collections managers themselves understand their own data and understand the data in their databases and what they can do when they share that information. They understand their own information better. They understand more about what makes their collections unique. They understand how they can take action on that data. And the Paleo Data Working Group is really taking all of this work to a new level. And I think that's my point is often when we talk about these initiatives, we hear about the big players. We hear about projects, organization, industry. We hear, and I'm thinking about this is a single-handed effort by a single individual that's having a fundamental change in the way people are sharing data and understanding their own data and their power to affect that data. And so when we want this enhanced data and we want extended data, this is having a huge effect. And I think it's important to remember the individual. And I don't know what the people here who are affiliated with these larger projects have to think about that, empowering the individual.
Thanks, Deb.
Yeah, Deb, that could be a way that Action Center could help, particularly since it could get NSF funding perhaps, whereas, for instance, the federal collections hardly can support themselves. So it's more difficult for federal collections to get involved with individuals and provide that kind of support. And it also speaks to what Scott was talking about before, which is kind of a hybrid model, I think, Scott.
Would anyone else like to comment on this particular issue?
This is Gil Pam. Let me say one thing. I think that the idea of individuals' involvement is important. And I really think that an action center that provides, like Scott said, coordination and leadership can make that happen. One of the things that I think we miss maybe now is that there is not as much coordination between research and implementation. For example, for the digital extended specimen, somebody kind of needs to be in charge. And I could see an action center actually coordinating in a way that brings individuals together that are doing good things that contribute to the whole. has a very important role for that action center.
Thanks. I've been sort of going through the questions. Some of them have been commented on to some extent, but I think a few of them, maybe even if they've been commented on, may deserve a little bit more attention. So Dan Distel raises the point. So far, these discussions have avoided specifics, but at some point, the leadership of a national action center and the manner of participation of individual collections in a national action center must be determined. Have specific organizational structures been proposed? And Andy Bentley responds, I think it's too early to delve into these specifics, but whatever organizational system is put in place, it will allow for input and collaboration from all within our community. So I think that's both an important question to keep in mind and comment from Dan. But I think Andy is right on the mark there. As we've tried to emphasize, we're trying to jumpstart a community discussion around this topic. And at this point, all of the specifics are really up in the air. So for example, and I'll just throw out a few maybe more specific questions with regard to the organization, and we'll see what sorts of responses people might have. And because little pieces of this actually came up in some of your presentations today. To what extent do we envision an action center as being a physical central location versus a distributed center with different emphases in different locations? And the same thing could be considered true with regard to cyber infrastructure. Are we thinking about a centralized cyber infrastructure that could connect everything, or would there be pieces, sort of a federated model? I think all of this is to be determined, but it would be great if people had some thoughts that they'd like to weigh in on both the cyber infrastructure, because that actually gets at another question that Jyotsna raised that was actually directed at Breda about development of cyber infrastructure. And also the concept of there being a physical centralized center versus a distributed center. So if anybody has comments on those two components, it'd be great to hear from you.
I just want to reinforce what Dan said. And that to me is a perfect subject for a future focus group where we really need to iron out some details. And I think a focus group on organizational structure, central, distributed, whatever, that would be a great webinar all by itself.
Just to sort of add to what Gil was just saying, I think it would be important to explore lots of different models, like delve into the details of what are some models that are possible and think about the pros and cons and leave that final decision. And the final decision is going to rest with NSF or whoever is soliciting proposals and trying to fund the Action Center. But I think as the community, what we should be doing over the next several months is thinking into the specifics of what are different models that are possible and what are some of the pros and cons. So I do think it's still pretty early to get into all the specifics, but I think the workshops that we're going to have and potentially additional focus groups could be avenues to explore that.
Yeah. Thanks, Jyotsna. And then maybe we'll follow up with the question actually directly to Breda, and then others can comment as well. But Jyotsna says, what is your view on, and I think this is a quotation from one of your slides, Breda, leading development of cyber infrastructure, which you presented as a general goal. Are you leaning, or is BCoN leaning toward efforts to centralize funding skills, or more decentralized funding and skills to build a communal skill to maintain and improve cyber infrastructure? So again, I think just like a centralized versus decentralized leadership and management model, the same thing could be said for models of cyber infrastructure. So Breda, would you like to comment on that further?
Yeah, I don't know if we are down the road far enough to make any conclusions yet on that either. I do know there are many different groups that are already starting to think about cyber infrastructure, both in the US and in Europe and elsewhere. And we just need to make sure, as Andy says in his response, that we're contributing and collaborating, but we're not working against each other and, independently inventing the same or similar technologies or infrastructure to handle the extended specimen network. So I think anything is on the table at this point. And like Jyotsna said, I feel like we need to discuss the options and talk to the other partners and people working in this sphere and decide how to move forward.
It does seem like further development of the extended specimen and the associated network will be really critical to how we view a lot of these different aspects, because of course that's going to be important for cyber infrastructure development. It'll also be important for the other points that have been raised here in the Q&A with regard to attribution and so forth. And so as those sorts of efforts go forward, then that may help us as a community come up with some clearer ideas about how we might want to shape that cyber infrastructure. We've sort of touched on, I think, most of the topics, or there have been responses to most of the questions. Are there some other questions that people would like to raise from the audience? We still have over 60 participants on. If anyone else has further questions or comments, it would be great to entertain them briefly now. And maybe while we're letting people think about that briefly, I'll just comment that there is a series of workshops planned to address the topics that have been raised in the last 3 weeks in a bit more detail. The first one starting later this week at the New York Botanical Garden. There will be another one at the Field Museum at some point during the summer, and then one in Los Angeles later on in the fall. And in addition, as I mentioned briefly before, there will be some focus groups on particular topics, as Gil mentioned as well. So there will be opportunities for in-person engagement on the topic further, and also we welcome comments via the discourse platform. Let's see. Deb, I see your hand is up. Is that still up from before, or did you have an additional comment? Sorry if I missed you.
No, you did fine. I would add to, and again, this is an open discussion. For many years now, we talk about workforce capacity development and training, but it's like filling a bucket that's leaking, right? If we don't provide ways that this can be professionalized and people can count on a career in this and have a living wage and a position that's not based on soft money, this is always, we suffer from institutional knowledge loss, individual knowledge loss constantly in the collection. So we need a way to figure out how, and Jyotsna mentioned this. So thinking very carefully about how we can advocate for collections locally, help them make the argument with their local administrators so that the value is there. And I mean, there are many of us, I suspect, who have ideas about how to do this. I think a group could get together and there could be some things we could do. So again, Bionomia, as an example, just it's an easy one, really. How else do you, right now, as a collection, know how many things were collected by how many people, how many were identified by whom, what scientific papers have been published as a result of what you have, what over time, who did the work where. So because this giant pivot table in the sky allows an organization to look at that, it becomes very easy for a collection manager or somebody running the collections to look at that data, which is growing all the time, and go to their administrator and show concrete value. So one specific example, and I'll stop, was a researcher who I enticed, who's a senior career researcher. They don't really need the credit. They're not really super motivated to do the work because they don't need it. However, please do it for me, as I said, and they went and did it and immediately discovered 2 papers they had no idea about. that were published using their specimen records. So of course, this influences their direct impact of their KPIs, their key performance indicators, but also that of their organization. And here locally, in my own experience, the director is asking, what's our local impact? What's our global impact? And how can we change our local impact and broaden it? And I think all of us in collections have great ideas for that, but we need to be empowered for that. And I see the comments in the chat, so I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, thanks for raising those points, Deb, and to those of you who touched on them in your comments earlier as well. And if anyone would like to comment further, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, we're trying to produce a report right now. We're calling it the Blue Report now. Basically, and Scott and Diane are involved in this to produce a major report on the accomplishments with scientific collections. That's been quite an effort led by Diane. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Diane, but basically what we're trying to have is page pullouts so that we can use them in various ways to show the value of collections, Deborah. So it's along the lines of what you're talking about. It's not tied to a particular very local collection, but it is tied to a collection, many of which are large collections. But it's still along the same way you're thinking.
Yeah, Kevin, I would chime in on that and say we're trying to put some tools into people's hands so that they can make this argument and make the substantiation for why the collections are vital and needed. Also, as I listen to your comments, all the thumbs up were going and people are like, she's on fire in the comments. I agree with all of this. And I think that there's going to come there with the bioeconomy, there's going to be really needed expertise in this space on these collections stewardship. And one of the reasons I talk about why I think people working in the bioeconomy need to have better understanding of existing federal collections and other collections is because there's a huge amount of expertise there. And what they're doing is, through lack of awareness, they're trying to build it on their own. So they go out and say, I would like to do some experiments with soil microbes. Well, gee, where do I get soil microbes? Well, I better start building a repository, or I better start creating something, and I better start hiring somebody who knows about soil microbes. When the stuff is there and the people are there, and there's all these microbes that Kevin just showed, out in, these places where USDA has been collecting them for decades, some of them from places that these companies could never sample again or could never get in the current day. So how do we bridge some kind of leverage there where we can get the kind of workforce support that's needed for the collections, because they're serving a much broader purpose. So anyway, I'm just throwing it out, food for thought. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so we need a centralized resource for some of these things. And as Joe Miller knows here, that GBIF publishes an annual report review of data use, and that's available at gbif.org. And so that's certainly one of the ways that we can keep track of how specimen and collection information is being used. But to Deb's point about the value of humans, which Diane built upon, I think that's really something that's important that we need to keep in mind. I think I'll make one more point and then we should probably wrap this up. And that is that there were a few questions or comments in the chat about the resources required to make sure that we can hear as many voices as possible in this discussion. So what about people who maybe don't have the resources to attend workshops and so on? I'll just note that for those workshops that IWGSC is organizing, IWGSC is covering the costs for workshop participation there, so that resource availability would not be a barrier. And I'll just maybe close things now by again thanking all of our panelists today, Breda, Jyotsna, Kevin, Diane, and Scott. And thanks also to, again, for our panelists from previous weeks. We really appreciate all of the time and thought you've put into your comments. And with that, thanks to everyone for your participation. And we look forward to receiving more input from you through discourse or through any other means that you'd like to share. So thanks and have a great day.